She arrived with nothing but a sack of bread and a broken name. Delilah Mercer had buried her husband, lost her farm to the drought, and been turned away from 5 towns in as many weeks. A widow at 44 with flour-dusted hands and nowhere left to walk. Then the blizzard hit. Montana in January doesn't warn you. It just swallows you whole. She should have kept moving. Every sensible instinct she had left told her to keep moving. But somewhere in that wall of white and wind she heard it. Thin, desperate, unmistakable. A child, crying. And Delilah Mercer, who had nothing left to lose, turned toward the sound instead of away from it. Like, comment, and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind had been lying to her all day. It would die down for 20 minutes, long enough to let her think she'd found the edge of it, long enough to let her shoulders drop and her grip on the canvas pack loosen just slightly. And then it would come roaring back, twice as mean, driving the snow sideways until she couldn't tell where the road ended and the ditch began. Delilah had been walking since before dawn. She knew the distance between Harlan and the next town, Cutter's Bend, was supposed to be 11 miles along the post road. She had asked the storekeeper in Harlan before she left, a narrow man named Fossey, who had watched her count out 6 pennies for a small block of salt, with the expression of someone watching something unfortunate happen to someone they didn't particularly like. 11 miles, he'd said, give or take. That had been 8 hours ago. The pack on her back held the tools of what had become, through absolute necessity, her trade. A tin bread pan, a cloth sack of flour she'd traded for 2 loaves in Harlan, a smaller sack of dried yeast, salt, a lard tin that was down to its last third, and 6 finished loaves wrapped in cheesecloth that she'd baked in the small stove at the boarding house before the landlady had told her the room was needed and put her out with polite firmness and no refund. The loaves were hard by now. 4 hours in the cold will do that. She'd have to warm them before anyone would buy them, and whether Cutter's Bend would let her warm them was a matter she was trying not to think about too directly, because if she thought about it too directly, she'd have to sit down in the snow. And if she sat down in the snow in this wind, she had a clear understanding of what would happen next. She was 44 years old. She had been a farmer's wife for 19 of those years in a valley east of Billings, where the grass used to grow knee-high in June, and the creek ran cold and clear from the mountain snowpack until 3 years ago when the snowpack didn't come, and the creek turned to a trickle, and then a mud line, and then nothing. Thomas had held on longer than most. He was not the kind of man who quit easily. But the land doesn't negotiate, and by the second dry summer the cattle were gone, and by the third the bank had taken a position on the matter that left very little room for discussion. Thomas had died in October, 2 weeks after they signed the papers giving back the farm, and Delilah had decided later, alone in the months that followed, that he hadn't died of anything you could name on a document. He had just stopped. When the farm went, the thing that had kept him upright went with it, and the body follows when the will is gone. She had sold what little was left and started moving. The first town had been polite about it. The second less so. By the fourth, a woman alone with a pack and a trade that amounted to knocking on strangers' doors had been made to understand, through a combination of locked doors and cold stares, that she was the wrong kind of presence. Too old to be hiring on as domestic help. Or so she was told, though she suspected the truth was simpler and less flattering. A widow without family or address had a way of making people nervous. Like she might be the first sign of something contagious. So she walked. The road, or what she believed was still the road, had disappeared under a foot of fresh snow sometime around mid-afternoon. She was navigating by the fence posts now, or trying to. They appeared in and out of the white curtain ahead of her at intervals that suggested she was still roughly parallel to something, though whether it was the post road or a cattle track or simple luck was impossible to say. The temperature had dropped sharply in the last hour. She could feel it in the way her face had stopped hurting and started simply going absent, which was the more worrying of the 2 options. She didn't pray. She had tried that, those long months after Thomas, and found no evidence of anyone listening. What she did instead was talk to herself in her head, a running commentary that was part inventory and part argument. You still have feeling in your feet. That's good. Keep moving them. Don't shuffle. Pick them up. The fence posts are getting closer together, which means something, possibly a corner. Corners mean property lines. Property lines mean buildings somewhere. Keep going. She almost missed it. The sound was faint. She registered it first as wind doing something strange around a structure, which can sound almost human when the conditions are right. But then it came again, and it was distinctly not wind. It It was the particular register of a child who has been crying for a long time and is now crying without much hope that crying will help, which is a different sound from ordinary distress. Lower, more exhausted, more frightened in its way, because ordinary distress still believes something will come. She stopped. The fence turned right here. She could see the corner post through a brief thinning of the snow. Beyond it, maybe 200 yards across what had to be a pasture, there was a shape. Not a natural shape. Straight lines where the landscape had none. A roof line, a chimney. The chimney had smoke coming from it, or had recently, because the snow around its base was a different color in the failing light, old ash gray against pure white. The sound again. A child. Inside or very close. Delilah stood at that fence corner for a moment that felt much longer than it was. The sensible part of her mind, the part that had been keeping her alive for 3 years of increasing hardship, ran through the calculation quickly. You are cold, you are near the end of what you have, you do not know these people, you will likely be sent away. You cannot afford the 200 yards across that field and back. But the child was still crying. She climbed through the fence, snagging her coat on the wire and not stopping to free it carefully, just pulling until the fabric tore, and crossed the pasture toward the shape in the snow. The ranch, when she reached it, was not in good condition. She noticed this the way you notice things when you're also noticing other things. Not as a judgment, but as a fact. The fence along the west side of the yard had been repaired recently and badly. New wires strung over old posts that had rotted and tilted over winter until they stood at angles that wouldn't hold against anything serious. There was a wagon in the yard with its wheel off, sitting on a crate, snow piled over everything, and no sign the wheel was coming back on any time soon. The barn doors were closed, but one of the upper boards had blown loose and was hanging at an angle, banging intermittently against the wall in the wind. The house itself was log and plank, solid enough, 2 stories, with a covered porch that had lost most of its railing at some point. Light in the lower windows, smoke from the chimney, but not much smoke, and not the fat black kind that means a serious fire. The thin gray kind that means the wood is almost gone, or the fire is being held very small. She knocked. Nothing for a moment. Then a sound of movement, cautious, inside. "Who's there?" A child's voice. Older than the crying she'd heard. She'd heard 2 distinct sounds, she realized, as she crossed the yard. The crying inside was younger. This voice, through the door, was perhaps 10 or 11. "My name is Delilah Mercer," she said, keeping her voice level. "I was on the road to Cutter's Bend and the storm got bad. I'm not looking for trouble. I have bread." A pause. Then, "Papa's not here." "When will he be back?" Another pause. "Don't know. He went to the south pasture this morning." Delilah looked back at the yard, then up at the sky, which by now was the uniform gray-white of serious winter and giving nothing away. A man in the south pasture in this storm, on foot or on horse, was not a man who was coming back before dark, and dark was maybe 40 minutes away. "How many of you are in there?" she asked. A long hesitation. 4. "How old are you?" 11. Caleb is 9. The little ones are 6 and 4. 4 children alone in a house with a small fire, and one of them crying. She did the math on how long that had been manageable, and concluded it was not going to be manageable much longer. "My hands are too cold to be a danger to anybody," she said. "Will you let me in? I'll get the fire going properly, and I won't touch anything I'm not told to touch." Another pause. Shorter this time. The bolt slid back. The girl's name was Nora. She was 11 and looked it in the face, sharp, watchful, with her mother's jaw, though Delilah wouldn't know that until later. She was not looking 11 anywhere else. She was standing in the doorway of her own house with the expression of someone who had been making adult decisions for longer than she should have had to. And she looked at Delilah with the particular combination of relief and suspicion that only comes from being very tired and very scared and needing help too much to refuse it. The inside of the house was cold. Not dangerously cold, but cold enough that the children's breath showed faintly. The fire in the iron stove was exactly what she'd feared from outside. 2 logs and some kindling, making a brave attempt at warmth and losing. The wood box beside the stove was nearly empty. 1 small piece of split pine and a handful of bark scraps. The crying was coming from a small girl in the corner of the main room, 4 years old, sitting on a braided rug and crying with the automatic quality of a child who has used up her ideas for feeling better and is simply enduring. Beside her, sitting with the rigid stillness of a child who has decided he is supposed to be brave and is finding it hard work, was a boy of about 6 with the same dark hair and wide-set eyes as Nora. The fourth child, Caleb, was sitting at the kitchen table with a tin plate in front of him. The plate was empty. Delilah took all of this in with one sweep of the room, and then she turned to Nora. "Woodpile outside?" she asked. "Around back. I haven't been able to carry enough by myself. The storm came fast. I'll get wood first, then we'll sort out the rest." She went out into the wind without setting down her pack, found the woodpile around the back of the house under a sagging lean-to, and spent 3 trips carrying as much wood as she could in arms that had almost no feeling left. She stacked it inside the door on her second trip, got a fire going properly on the third. Real fire, with purpose, a fire that was going to stay. And then she sat down on the floor next to the stove with her coat still on and waited for her hands to start working again. The 4-year-old had stopped crying, or mostly stopped. She was staring at Delilah from the rug with eyes that were too large for the situation and still wet at the edges. The 6-year-old had unclenched slightly. "What's her name?" Delilah asked Nora. "May. The boy is Henry." "Are you hungry?" Nora's face did something complicated. "We had some porridge this morning." That was the entire answer. Delilah opened her pack and took out 2 of the loaves. They were cold and hard, but the stove was warming now. She set them on the flat iron surface of the stove's top to warm, balancing them carefully, and then she looked at Caleb, who was still sitting at the table watching her. "You've had nothing since morning?" she asked. He shook his head, not sulking, just honest. 15 minutes, she said. "Maybe 20. The bread was not what it would have been fresh. The cold had changed it, and reheating on a stovetop is not the same as coming out of an oven, and she knew it. But she watched Caleb eat his portion with a focused intensity that made something in her chest pull tight and ache. And May, who had stopped crying entirely and migrated across the room during the warming process, ate hers with both hands wrapped around it, sitting so close to the stove that Delilah had to gently move her back twice. "Papa will be angry," Nora said. She was eating her own bread standing up, as though she didn't want to commit to being at rest. "At me?" "At us. For letting a stranger in." "That's fair," Delilah said. "He doesn't know me." "Do you know him?" "No?" Nora chewed and thought. "Then you're not really a stranger to each other. You're just people who haven't met." Delilah looked at her for a moment. "That's a very specific distinction." "Mama used to say that." Nora said it flatly, without changing expression, and then looked away. There it was. Delilah had suspected it from the moment she walked in. The particular quality of disorder in the house. Not the disorder of a man who doesn't care, but the disorder of someone who has been doing more than he can manage for too long, things slowly falling behind. A home that had been someone's, and was now trying to remember how to still be one without her. She didn't ask. She filed it away and put another log on the fire. Gideon Cross came in 2 hours after dark. She heard the horse first, then the boots on the porch, and then the door opened and a man came in who was quite obviously at the exact end of whatever he had in him. He was tall, considerably taller than the doorframe should have required, but he ducked instinctively, the habit of a man who'd been ducking that particular doorframe for years. He was wearing a coat that had been good once, and was now held together in 2 places by wire rather than buttons. And his face had the particular grayish exhaustion of someone who has been cold for so long they've stopped registering it. He saw her. He stopped dead in the middle of the room. The children were all asleep, Nora on the settle, May and Henry in the corner nest of quilts they'd made, Caleb at the table with his head on his arms. The fire was going strong. The room was warm. And there was a woman he had never seen in his life sitting in his kitchen chair with her hands wrapped around a tin cup. "Who are you?" he said. Not aggressively. Too tired for aggressive, but with the alertness of a man who had been surprised and wasn't sure yet what kind of surprise this was. "Delilah Mercer," she said, keeping her voice low so the children wouldn't wake. "I was on the road to Cutter's Bend. I heard your youngest crying and came in. Your daughter let me in." He looked at the sleeping children. His expression when he looked at Nora was brief and difficult to read. She shouldn't have done that. Probably not by the usual rule. But it was very cold and there was almost no wood inside and nothing to eat. She kept her voice even. "I got wood and I had bread." He was still watching her. She met it directly, which she had learned was better than looking away. "I'm not asking to stay," she said. I was going to leave when you got back, except the storm got worse, and I don't know if the road is passable. I'll sleep in the barn if you'll let me. I'll be gone when it clears." I was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the fire, the proper solid fire that was filling the room, and at the empty tin plate near May's sleeping spot that still had breadcrumbs on it, and at the stack of wood she'd brought in that was now the difference between tonight being manageable and it not being. "There's a cot in the back room," he said finally. "It's cold back there." "I've been in the cold all day," she said. "Cold doesn't scare me anymore." I hung his coat on the hook by the door with the movements of a man whose shoulders were aching badly. "I'm Gideon Cross," he said. He didn't offer a hand. She didn't expect him to. "I know, Nora told me." He looked at the breadcrumbs again. "I'll pay you for the bread." "You don't need to." "I don't take charity." She picked her cup up and stood. "Then call it a business arrangement. I bake, I sell. You bought bread tonight and you can pay me in the morning. That's commerce, not charity." She held out the cup to him. "There's coffee. I made it from what was in the tin on the shelf. I figured you'd come in needing it." He looked at the cup for a moment, then took it. "The back room," he said. She picked up her pack and went. Oh, she was still there 3 days later. That wasn't the plan. The plan, such as it was, had been to sleep in the back room, wait out the storm, and leave on the first passable morning. The first morning wasn't passable. The second morning she woke at 5 and baked 2 batches before the children got up. And by the time Gideon came in from the morning chores, there was warm bread on the table, and he sat down and ate without saying anything about her still being there. On the third morning, May climbed into her lap while she was at the table doing something with the lard tin, and sat there with the complete ease of a 4-year-old who has decided a person is safe. And Delilah sat very still for a moment and then put one hand carefully on the child's back. She didn't leave on the third morning either. The situation, she told herself, was practical. Gideon was managing a working ranch, cattle in the south pasture, a small number of horses, a milk cow, chickens that had mostly stopped laying, largely alone, which meant he was coming in after dark and going out before full light, and everything that happened inside the house in between fell to Nora, who was 11 years old and doing a remarkable job and should not have been doing it at all. There were meals that weren't being made. There was a cracked window in the back bedroom that had been stuffed with cloth but was still losing heat. There was a line in the ledger book she found open on the shelf. She wasn't looking at it, but she had eyes that suggested the ranch's finances were not in a situation that would comfortably absorb losing a month of productivity to a man who spent half his waking hours doing domestic work because he had no help. She was there. She had skills. She would use them. She told herself that was the whole of it. On the 4th day, Caleb came and watched her knead bread. He sat on the stool by the table and watched with the focused attention of a 9-year-old who has decided something is interesting, which is a very complete kind of attention. "Why do you push it like that?" he asked. "Develops the gluten, makes it stretchy. If you don't do it long enough, it won't rise right." "What's gluten?" "Part of the flour. It's what gives the bread its structure." He considered this. "So you're building the inside before you bake the outside." She looked at him. Yes. That's more or less exactly right." He seemed pleased by this without being smug about it, which she liked. "Can I try?" She gave him a portion of dough and showed him the motion. Heel of the hand, push and fold, quarter turn. And he tried it with the serious concentration of a child learning something real. "Harder than it looks," he said. "Most things are. Will you teach me how to make the whole thing?" "If your father says it's all right." Caleb glanced toward the window and then back at her. "He won't say it's not all right. He just won't say anything." She thought about this. "Is that how he is?" "He used to talk more," Caleb said, without sentiment, just as a report of fact, "before Mama got sick." She didn't push it. She just moved his hands to the right position on the dough, and they kept working. The ledger book was a problem. She hadn't meant to look at it. It had been open on the shelf for 3 days, and she'd been deliberately not looking at it, out of respect for a privacy that wasn't hers. But on the 5th morning, Gideon had left it on the table when he went out, and she'd sat down with her coffee, and it had been right there, and she had looked. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were worse than that. They were the kind of numbers that look manageable if you don't look too carefully, and if you look carefully, you can see the architecture of a slow collapse. A cattle loan from the previous year at a rate that was steep without being illegal. A payment missed in October, 2 payments missed in November. A notation in the margin in Gideon's handwriting. Neat writing, she noticed, the handwriting of a man who'd had some schooling, that said talk to Hargrove, 30 days and then nothing after. Hargrove was a name she'd heard before, in Harlan. A creditor. The kind of creditor whose name gets mentioned in the same tone as weather systems and other things that come at you and don't negotiate. She closed the ledger carefully and put it back where she'd found it and went and started the bread for the day. That evening, when Gideon came in and the children were occupied with the small tasks she'd given them to keep the evening structured, Henry and May setting the table, Caleb feeding kindling to the stove, Nora reading to May from the battered primer that was the extent of their book collection, she said without preamble. The Hargrove note. How much time do you have left? He was washing his hands at the basin. He went still. I saw the ledger, she said. It was open and I have eyes. I'm not apologizing for looking, because I think you need someone to look at it. He turned around. His expression was careful, not angry, which was what she'd half expected. Careful, in the way of a man deciding whether to be honest. 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 4. What happens at 4 weeks? He takes a lien on the property. Can the cattle cover it? Not if he insists on the full principal. She nodded slowly. What does he want, if it's not the money? Gideon was quiet for a moment. He's been after this land for 2 years. The access road through the east pasture connects 2 of his parcels. If he gets a lien and presses it, he gets the land, she said, or enough of it. The children were still at their tasks, not listening, or listening in the specific way of children who understand that something adult is happening and are pretending not to notice. The bread sells, she said. What? In town. If I could get to Cutter's Bend twice a week, maybe Harlan on alternating days. I know how much flour costs and how much bread sells for, and the margin is... She stopped. I'm doing it again. And doing what? Putting myself in the middle of something that isn't mine. She looked at her hands. My husband used to say I saw a problem the way a dog sees a bone. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He wasn't wrong. She almost smiled. He wasn't, no. You're talking about a daily ride in January to sell bread from town to town. I'm talking about a cash stream that doesn't exist right now, that could. She met his eyes. I'm not suggesting I solve your problem. I'm suggesting that if I'm going to be here anyway for a few more days, I might as well be useful in a specific way rather than just a general one. I was still watching her. She couldn't read him easily. He had a face that had learned to hold still in the way of people who've had too many things go wrong to afford expressions. You're planning on leaving, he said, after the storm clears. I was. She didn't answer that directly. I'll stay until the road is clear enough to be sure I can make it to Cutter's Bend. And if you sell bread there, then I'll come back and report what it got, and we can talk about whether it makes sense to do it again. He nodded once. It was the minimum possible agreement, but it was agreement. I'll hitch the wagon, he said. Oh, Cutter's Bend was 12 buildings and a post road that connected it to more useful places. Delilah went in on a Wednesday with 6 loaves and a tin of small round rolls she'd made from the last of a batch, and sold everything she had within 2 hours. Not because Cutter's Bend was particularly hungry or particularly generous, it was neither, but because she had baked that bread correctly, and it smelled the way it was supposed to smell, and people who live a long way from any real bakery will pay for the smell of bread almost before they'll pay for the taste. She came back with $2.60. She set it on the table in front of Gideon without speaking. He looked at it. He looked at her. For 6 loaves and some rolls? I could sell more if I had more flour. The woman at the dry goods store wants to know if I can do a standing order every Wednesday. He was quiet for a moment, doing the math with the focus of a man who had been doing desperate math for so long it was second nature. If you could clear $2 every Wednesday, and if Harlan is the same on Fridays, which I think it will be, that's $17 to $18 a month. He sat back in the chair. That covers the Hargrove payment with something left. Something left to put toward the principal, she said. Not fast, but steady. He was looking at the coins on the table like they were a language he'd forgotten he could read. I'd need a share of the flour cost, she said, and I'll need to use your oven when you're not... You don't have to ask to use the oven, he said. This is your... He stopped. A silence opened up that was not comfortable, but it was honest. Your kitchen, he finished quietly. She didn't correct him. She picked up the coins and set them on the ledger, where he'd be able to find them, and went to see what May had gotten into while she'd been gone. From the outside, she understood, it didn't look simple. It was Nora who told her, 2 weeks in, what was being said in town. She told her the way children tell hard things, bluntly, without softening, because they haven't yet learned to soften, or sometimes because they think the adult deserves to hear it straight. Mrs. Aldrich says you moved yourself in to catch a widower, Nora said. She was helping Delilah sort dried beans at the table, the task requiring no more than steady hands, and gave the mouth something to do besides hold words back. She says you're brazen. What do you think? Delilah asked. Nora was quiet for a moment. I think Mrs. Aldrich talks about other people more than she talks about herself, which seems like a waste. That's an interesting observation. Is it true what she says? Delilah stopped sorting. She considered how to answer this, which meant she was going to answer it honestly and was just deciding where to start. No, I came in from a storm because you were hungry. Everything after that has been practical. She paused. Your father is a decent man in a hard situation. I'm a woman with skills and nowhere to go. That's what this is. Nora looked at her for a long moment with those flat, sharp eyes that had been doing adult assessments since before they should have had to. Okay, she said. Okay? I believe you. She went back to the beans. I just wanted to know if you'd lie to me. Delilah picked up her own handful of beans. I won't lie to you, Nora. That's a promise I'll keep. The girl nodded once, the same minimum possible agreement her father used, and they sorted beans in the warm kitchen while the wind moved around the eaves outside, and May came in with her boots on the wrong feet asking for something, and the afternoon settled into the ordinary particular texture of those weeks. Not peaceful, exactly, but real, in a way Delilah had not felt anything be real for a very long time. The snow came again on a Thursday night, heavier than the first storm, and by Friday morning the world outside the ranch windows was remade into something indifferent and absolute. Gideon came in from the morning chores with frost on his beard and an expression she was learning to read. Not distress, but the specific controlled assessment of a man calculating odds. South fence is down in 2 places, he said. 3 cattle got through. I found 2 of them. The third? Still looking. May, at the table eating her breakfast, said, Where does it go when it's lost? Somewhere warmer, probably, Henry said with the authority of a 6-year-old who has decided he knows things. There is no somewhere warmer, Caleb said, and then looked at Delilah as though he'd said something he hadn't meant to say out loud. She looked back at him steadily. Go help your father, she said. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. He went without arguing, which she noted, 9 years old and already knowing when the adult was right. Gideon paused at the door. He looked at her, the same careful, unhurried look he gave things he was assessing. I'll be a few hours, he said. I'll have food when you come back. He nodded and went out into the white. She stood at the window for a moment after he was gone, watching the snow, the fence line barely visible, the 2 shapes of Gideon and Caleb moving together across the field, and she thought, not planned, not decided, just thought, that this was the kind of morning she had known once, the kind of morning that belongs to a life, and that she had not expected to know one again, and did not know yet what to do with that, so she went and started the bread. The 3rd cattle turned up 2 days later. Gideon found it on the far side of the south ridge, alive but in bad shape. 1 foreleg caught between 2 frozen fence rails where it had tried to push through and gotten stuck, standing there for who knows how long in the cold, with the particular dumb stoicism of cattle that don't have the sense to stop fighting something they can't win. He came back with it limping on a lead rope and a cut across his left hand from the wire he'd had to pull apart. And he didn't mention the hand until Nora pointed at it at dinner and said, Papa, you're bleeding on the table. He looked down at it with mild surprise, as though the hand belonged to someone else, and its condition was not his immediate concern. Delilah was up and at the shelf for the cloth strips before he could say it was fine. She'd learned in the 3 weeks since the first storm that he would say it was fine about almost everything, and that fine was not always an accurate report. Give me your hand, she said. He gave her his hand. There was something careful in the way he did it. Not reluctant, but measured, the way a man hands over something he's used to handling himself. The cut was deep enough to have kept bleeding through the cold, which meant it had been bleeding for hours, which meant he'd worked through the afternoon with a hand that needed to be dealt with, and had decided not to interrupt the work for it. She cleaned it, which involved carbolic she'd bought in Cutter's Bend on her second Wednesday run, and which stung sufficiently that his jaw tightened, though he didn't pull the hand back. "The cattle's leg?" she asked, keeping her voice practical because he responded better to practical. "Not broken. Strained. She'll be off at a week." "You'll lose milk." "I know." "I'll cut the bread portions this week. Make up the difference elsewhere." He looked at her. She was wrapping the cloth strips around his palm with the focused attention she gave anything she'd decided to do well. "You don't have to account for every—" "I'm not accounting," she said. "I'm just thinking out loud." She tied off the bandage and released his hand, and he flexed it once, testing. "That's tighter than it needs to be," he said. "It needs to stay closed. It won't do that if it's loose." She gathered the cloth scraps and the carbolic bottle. "Eat your dinner before it's cold." He ate his dinner. Across the table, Henry watched his father's bandaged hand with an expression of deep scientific interest, and May ate her bread in the methodical way of a child who has discovered that bread is one of the most reliable things in the world and is treating it accordingly. Caleb said, "Mrs. Delilah, can I do the rolls tomorrow?" She looked at him. He'd been practicing. She'd been letting him practice on the smaller batches, the ones that didn't need to be perfect because they were for the house. He was getting better. His hands had the instinct for it, which not everyone did. "The Cutter's Bend batch needs to be right," she said. "You can do the house rolls." He nodded, satisfied with this, in the way of a child who's been given a real answer instead of a managed one. Gideon watched this exchange without speaking. She'd noticed he did that. Watched the children with her with a particular quality of attention, not suspicious, more like a man observing something he wasn't sure he had words for. The gossip reached her properly for the first time on a Wednesday in late January. She'd known it was circulating. Nora had told her what Mrs. Aldrich said, and there had been something in the way the woman at the dry goods store in Cutter's Bend looked at her on the second Wednesday that was friendly enough on the surface and had a question mark underneath it. But she hadn't had it directed at her face until the day she set up the bread on the table outside the post office, the way she'd started doing on Wednesday mornings, and a woman named Pratt. She learned the name later. At the time, she was just a woman in a good wool coat, and the expression of someone who has appointed themselves to say something came and stood in front of the table and said, without buying anything, "You're the widow staying out at the Cross Ranch." "I am," Delilah said. "How long have you been there now?" "Coming on a month?" Mrs. Pratt's expression suggested this was longer than the occasion warranted. "And you're baking for him?" "I'm baking for sale," Delilah said. "I sell here on Wednesdays. I sell in Harlan on Fridays." "Out of his kitchen?" "Out of the kitchen at the ranch where I'm currently staying, yes." The distinction seemed to irritate Mrs. Pratt rather than satisfy her. "It's a small community," she said. "People notice things." "I expect they do." "A widow alone with a man and his children." "4 children," Delilah said, "who were cold and underfed when I arrived, and who have a father who is working himself past what one man can manage. I'm doing work that needs doing." She looked at the woman directly. "If that's something your community objects to, I'll hear the specific objection. But people notice things isn't an objection, it's just noise." Mrs. Pratt's mouth went tight. She left without buying bread, which was fine. The woman behind her bought 2 loaves, and the small woman after that bought 3, and asked if she could put in an order for next week. And Delilah sold out her entire batch by 10 in the morning, which was the best result she'd had yet. But driving back on the wagon, the cold air finding the gaps in her coat collar, she sat with the conversation and turned it over. Not because Mrs. Pratt had said anything she didn't know. She'd known what the talk was, in the rough shape of it, since Nora told her. But because hearing it directly had made it more real, and more real meant it had consequences she needed to think about. She was a woman without standing in a place that had decided opinions about what that meant. She had no husband, no family, no address. She was living in a man's house. The fact that she had been surviving on bread sales and hard work for a year before she arrived at his door was not visible to Mrs. Pratt, who only saw the current arrangement. She got back to the ranch in the early afternoon and found Nora teaching May to write letters at the kitchen table, May clutching the pencil with the grip of someone trying to prevent it from escaping, and Henry asleep on the settle, and Caleb at the window watching the yard with the stillness of a child who has something on his mind. "Was it good?" he asked, meaning the sales. "Sold out." "I told you the rolls would go fast." "You did," she agreed. "You were right." She hung up her coat and scarf. "What are you watching for?" He didn't answer right away. Then, Papa's been out past the west barn for 2 hours. He said an hour. She looked out the window. The west barn was visible. What was beyond it wasn't. The sky had been flat gray all day, the kind of flat gray that doesn't mean storm, but means the temperature was holding at the wrong number. He's dealt with worse than 2 hours in the cold, she said. But she filled the kettle and put it on the stove. Gideon came in 40 minutes later with the news that the fence repair on the north side had taken longer than expected, and that one of the horses had thrown a shoe, which added a task to tomorrow's list that the day didn't have room for. He said this standing in the middle of the kitchen, still in his coat, reporting the day's damage in the clipped way he'd started doing with her. Not because she'd asked for reports, but because at some point it had become natural to say the day's problems out loud to someone who would hear them without flinching. She handed him the coffee and listened. When he was done, she said, "I sold out in Cutter's Bend, $2.80. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "That's the best yet. I'll do $3 next week if I can get the flour." She set her own cup down. "I had a conversation with a woman named Pratt." His expression shifted, small but visible. "Margaret Pratt. She had opinions about the arrangement here. She has opinions about most things. I told her the specific objection, or don't bother." Delilah looked at him steadily, which might have been the wrong approach for keeping things smooth. Gideon was quiet for a moment. It was probably the right approach. It won't make her friendlier. She was never going to be friendly. He set the cup down and looked at it, rather than at her, which he did when he was deciding how much to say. "My wife, Ruth, she and Margaret Pratt were friendly, years back. When Ruth got sick, Pratt came around twice and then didn't come again. Ruth noticed. I noticed." He picked the cup back up. "She's not someone whose opinion I put weight on." It was the most he had said about Ruth in one sentence since Delilah arrived. She didn't pull on it. "All right," she said. "I just wanted you to know what was being said." "I already knew." "I figured you did." They were quiet for a moment, the kettle making its small sounds on the stove and May's voice from the table asking Nora if the letter she'd written was right, and Nora saying it was mostly right, and May asking what mostly meant. "Does it bother you?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "It bothers me the way weather bothers me. I don't want it, but I'm not going to stop what I'm doing because of it." He looked at her then. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't name exactly. Not quite a smile, but in the family of one. "That's a sensible way to look at it," he said. "I've had practice," she said, and went to help May with her letters. February came in cold and stayed that way. The bread business was doing what she'd said it would do. Not dramatic, not fast, but steady. Wednesdays in Cutter's Bend, Fridays in Harlan, and she'd added Tuesdays at a small general supply store between the two towns, whose owner, a quiet man named Birch, had asked her on her third visit if she could leave a standing order, and she'd said she could if he paid in advance, and he'd said that was fair. The advance payments were the difference between the Hargrove obligation and not. She kept a running count in a small notebook she'd started carrying: flour cost, wood cost for the baking days, sales receipts, what went back into the household account versus what she held for supplies. It was not a large operation, but it was orderly, and orderly was what they needed. Gideon handled the ranch side with the same focused exhaustion he'd been operating on since before she arrived. The cattle were surviving the winter, the lamed cow was improving, and he'd managed to repair the north fence over 3 hard days with Caleb helping on the easier sections. He didn't talk much about the future. She'd noticed this, the way he kept his thinking close, managing the present and not letting himself extend much further. She understood it. When things are bad for long enough, planning ahead starts to feel like setting yourself up for another failure. So you stop planning and just try to get through what's immediately in front of you. She'd done it herself. It was a reasonable response to sustained damage, and it worked for surviving, and it was terrible for anything else. She didn't say this to him. It wasn't her place, and it wasn't the time, but she thought it. Nora turned 12 in the first week of February. Delilah made her a cake, which required a separate procurement of sugar from Cutter's Bend, and a small amount of planning that she conducted without telling Nora, which required telling Caleb, who was not a natural keeper of secrets but managed this one adequately. The cake was a simple thing, butter cake with a dried apple filling because fresh was not a possibility in February in Montana. And when she set it on the table at dinner, Nora looked at it with an expression that moved through surprise and into something raw that she controlled quickly, the practiced emotional discipline of a child who has learned to manage her own feelings because the adults around her were too overwhelmed to absorb them. "I didn't expect this," Nora said. "I know," Delilah said. "Mama used to make cake." She said it the way she said most things about Ruth, as a fact, not as grief, though the grief was in the factual tone itself. "Tell me what kind." "Spice cake, with molasses icing. It was too sweet." She paused. "I'd give a lot to have some right now." Delilah looked at her. "When I can get molasses, I'll make it." "You don't know the recipe." "Describe it to me and I'll get close." Nora looked at her for a moment. "You think you can just reconstruct someone's recipe from a description?" "I think I can come close enough that it'll taste like someone who loved your mother tried." Delilah kept her voice steady. "That's not the same as hers, but it's not nothing." Nora was quiet. Then she picked up her fork. "She used a lot of cinnamon," she said, "more than most people would." "Good to know," Delilah said, and served the first slice. Gideon watched the whole exchange from across the table. He watched his daughter eat birthday cake and talk about her mother without flinching, and he watched Delilah let her do it without filling the space with comfort or sympathy, just listening and filing it away. And something in his face that had been held tight for a long time shifted very slightly. "I didn't say anything." But after dinner, when the children were in bed and Delilah was at the table going over the week's accounts, he came and sat down across from her, not with anything to say, apparently, just with his coffee, and sat there in the lamplight while she worked, and the silence between them was the specific kind of silence that means something rather than nothing. It was Henry who started calling her something other than Mrs. Delilah. How 6 and 6-year-olds relate to the world through categories, and at some point in February he had made a determination about what category she belonged in and started acting accordingly. It was small things at first, bringing her things she hadn't asked for, a particular smooth stone he'd found in the yard, a drawing of the barn that was mostly accurate. And then one morning he came downstairs while she was starting the bread and said, without any particular announcement, "Are you going to stay here forever?" She paused in the kneading. "I don't know about forever." "But for a long time?" "I hope so," she said, which surprised her slightly, the honesty of it. "Why?" He thought about this with the seriousness of a child dealing with a real question. "Because May doesn't cry at night as much," he said, "and Papa comes inside earlier." She looked at him. "Does he usually stay out late?" "After Mama died, he used to stay in the barn until really late. Nora said he was working, but I don't think he was just working." He picked up a piece of dough she'd trimmed off and turned it in his fingers. "Can I have this?" "No, it needs to bake." He put it back. "I think you should stay," he said, definitively, and went to find his boots. She stood at the table with her hands in the dough for a moment after he left, looking at the window where the morning was coming in pale and thin over the snow. And she thought about what he'd said. Not the conclusion, but the observation. May crying less at night. Gideon coming inside earlier. The small evidence of a house that was beginning to hold itself differently than it had been. She had not let herself think too directly about what she was to this family, or what they were to her, because thinking too directly about things that felt essential was a way of seeing how fragile they were. And she'd had too many fragile things come apart. But Henry had said it plainly, the way children say things that adults spend years not saying, and she couldn't unknow it. She kept working the dough. The bread needed to rise by 7 and be in the oven by 8 and out by 9 if she was going to make it to Harlan and back before dark. That was what she knew how to do. She did it. The trouble with Hargrove came to a head on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of February. She'd been in Harlan for the morning sales when she heard the name. Not from anyone speaking to her directly, but the way you hear things in a small town when people don't know you're there. She was in the back of Birch's supply store collecting her payment, when 2 men came in through the front and stood at the counter, talking in the way of men who didn't feel the need to lower their voices because they weren't saying anything they considered secret. The name Gideon Cross came up, and then the name Hargrove, and then a number. Not the loanment, a different number, a deadline. And the phrase sent a man out there, which meant Hargrove had already moved beyond the patient stage of the process. She paid for her flour with the money she'd collected that morning and drove back to the ranch harder than she usually drove, the horse working into the headwind and the cold, and when she got in the yard she saw a horse tied at the porch rail that wasn't Gideon's. The man inside was named Croft. He was Hargrove's man, which meant he was the kind of man you send to conversations you want to be uncomfortable. I was sitting at the kitchen table, At her kitchen table, a thought she registered and set aside. With a document in front of him and Gideon standing across from him with the particular controlled stillness of a man who is deciding between options. The children were not in the main room. Delilah did not know if Gideon had sent them elsewhere or if they'd gone on their own, but she registered their absence as something she was grateful for. "Mrs. Mercer," Gideon said when she came in. His voice was level. "This is Mr. Croft. He's here from Hargrove." Croft looked at her with the professional assessment of a man who deals in other people's difficulties. "You're the woman staying here?" "I am," she said, setting down her bag. "Mr. Hargrove has an interest in the parties involved in this property," he said. "I'm here to establish the timeline on the loan obligation and clarify the terms of the lien notice that was filed this week." She looked at Gideon. "A lien was filed this week?" "I received it yesterday," he said, and his voice had gone carefully flat, which meant he was angry and containing it. She looked at the document on the table. "May I?" Croft shrugged, which was permission enough. She picked it up. The document was what she'd expected, legal language around default terms, the lien on the east pasture and the access road specifically, which was exactly what Hargrove wanted. But there was a clause she hadn't expected, a personal liability provision attached to what appeared to be a secondary claim. Her name wasn't in it, but the language was broad enough that anyone operating a business from the property could be caught in it. "This provision," she said, pointing. "The commercial activity clause." Croft looked at it. "That's standard language." "It's not standard," she said. "It's specific, and it's written to cover anyone conducting income-producing activity from this property, which would include my bread sales." She set the document down. "Mr. Hargrove wants the access road. He doesn't want money. If he wanted money, he'd have taken the payment arrangement that was offered in November. He wants this property, and he's put this clause here to create additional leverage." She looked at Croft. "Tell me if I'm wrong." Croft had the expression of a man who had underestimated someone and was recalibrating. "I'm not in a position to speak to Mr. Hargrove's intentions." "No," she said. "You're in a position to carry messages." She picked up the document and folded it and held it out to him. "Tell Mr. Hargrove that the obligation is being met and that any claim on commercial activity from this property will be contested, and tell him that I'd be willing to have that conversation directly if he prefers." Croft took the document. He looked at Gideon, then back at her. Then he picked up his hat from the table and went to the door. "I'll relay your message," he said, and he left. She stood in the quiet of the kitchen after the sound of the horse leaving the yard died away. Her hands were trembling slightly. Not fear, she identified after a moment. Anger. The particular anger of someone who recognizes a rigged mechanism when they see one and is furious at the rigging. Gideon was still standing across the kitchen. "You know the law?" he said. "I know enough. My husband dealt with creditors in the drought years. I sat through enough of those conversations to learn what the language means." She turned and faced him. "He's going after the access road, and he's using me as a secondary lever. If I stay, he has more leverage. If I go, he has less." The words were in the room before she'd finished thinking them through. She heard what they meant, and so did he. "Delilah, I'm just saying what the situation is," she said. "I'm not saying what I'm going to do about it yet." He looked at her for a long, difficult moment. "The children would notice," he said finally, "if you weren't here." It was the closest thing to "please don't go" that she suspected he knew how to say, and she understood it as such. "I know," she said quietly. She went and started the fire for dinner, because the afternoon was getting cold, and the children would come back soon and they would need warmth and food, and that was what she knew how to provide, so she provided it. But her hands still had that slight tremor in them, and she was aware of Gideon at the other end of the kitchen, not quite deciding to leave, and of the document that had been on her table, and of a choice that was shaping up in front of her that she hadn't asked for and couldn't walk away from cleanly, no matter which direction she went. She spent 3 days not deciding. That was the honest description of what she did. Though if you'd asked her, she would have said she was thinking it through, which was also true, but incomplete. She went to Cutter's Bend on Wednesday and sold bread and came back. She made dinner. She showed Caleb how to score the top of a loaf before it went in the oven, the shallow cuts that let the crust open properly instead of cracking ragged. She sat with May in the evening and let the child lean against her arm while Nora read aloud from the primer, Henry asleep already. Gideon across the room with the account books doing the same math he'd been doing for months, looking for room that wasn't there. She watched him when he wasn't watching her. She had become good at this, not staring, not making it a thing, just registering. The way he moved when he was tired versus when he was only worn down, which were different conditions with different causes. The way he talked to the children, patient in the way of a man who has decided that his own exhaustion is not their problem and holds to that decision even when it costs him. The way he sometimes stood in the doorway of whatever room she was in without coming in, as though he'd started toward her for a reason, and then thought better of naming it. She knew what was happening. She wasn't naive about it, and she wasn't pretending. What she was doing was deciding whether knowing it was enough of a reason to stay, or whether knowing it was exactly the reason she should go before it got complicated in ways neither of them had the capacity to manage. On the third night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Gideon said, "You're still deciding." She was at the table. He was standing near the stove, not quite facing her. "I told you I wasn't deciding yet," she said. "I'm still in that phase." "It's been 3 days. Some decisions need 3 days." He was quiet for a moment. "Croft came back to Harlan. Birch told me. He was asking questions about you, who you were, where you came from, how long you'd been here." She looked up from the table. "Hargrove's building a case, seems like." "For what exactly? I haven't done anything illegal." "He doesn't need illegal," Gideon said. "He needs uncomfortable. A widow living in a man's house, running a business off his property, involved in a loan dispute. That's enough for a legal filing that makes things difficult, even if it goes nowhere." He crossed his arms, the posture he took when he was frustrated with a situation he couldn't fix by working harder. "It's leverage, not law. I know what it is." She stood up. She was not going to have this conversation sitting down. "And I need to ask you something directly." He met her eyes. "Do you want me to go?" The silence that followed was not hesitation exactly. It was the pause of a man who had been asked the one question he'd been most carefully not asking himself. "No," he said. It came out flat and certain, the way he said things he'd decided about. "I don't want you to go, even knowing what it costs you." "The costs were already here before you arrived," he said. "You didn't bring Hargrove. You didn't bring the debt. You didn't bring any of it. You showed up in a blizzard because my daughter was crying and you had bread." He stopped. "What you've done since is... The ranch is still here partly because of what you've done since. And the kids..." He stopped again, in a different way. "You don't have to finish that," she said quietly. "I know I don't." He looked at her with the directness he used when he'd decided not to hold something back. "But I want to. Because I think you've been sitting with the idea that you're a burden here, and I want to say out loud that you're not. You're the opposite of that. You've been the opposite of that since the first night." She held his gaze. Something in her chest was doing what it always did when she'd been managing herself carefully for a long time. And someone said the thing that made the management suddenly harder than it had been. A loosening, not comfortable exactly, more like a held breath finally let go. "I'll stay," she said. "I'll deal with Hargrove." He nodded, one nod, controlled. But his shoulders had shifted, and she noticed it. "Then we deal with him together," he said. What together looked like, in practice, was Delilah writing a letter. She wrote it at the kitchen table over 2 evenings with Gideon beside her reading each sentence as she finished it. Not correcting, just reading, and occasionally saying more formal, or "That's good, keep that." She had a precise, clear hand from years of keeping farm accounts, and she used it to compose the kind of letter that says a great deal with very careful language about what would happen if certain actions were pursued. The implication being that someone on the receiving end would have to find out the hard way whether the implication was bluster or not. She was not entirely certain it wasn't bluster, but it was a well-constructed bluff. The letter cited the specific legal statutes governing creditor conduct in property disputes in the territory. She'd gotten these from the county clerk's posted notices that she'd been reading carefully in the Cutter's Bend post office for 3 weeks, in the calculated way of someone who suspects they'll need them. It noted the documented payment arrangement that had been proposed in November and rejected without stated cause. It made specific reference to the commercial activity clause as an unusual provision with no precedent in standard territorial loan agreements, language which implied, without stating, that someone had looked at it carefully. And it was signed by Delilah Mercer and Gideon Cross, jointly, which was the most important part. Not because joint signature had specific legal force, but because it said something about the situation, that there were 2 people here, not one vulnerable one, and that the situation was not the simple extraction Hargrove had designed it to be. Gideon read the final version twice. "You've done this before," he said. "Not exactly this, but like it." She capped the ink. Thomas dealt with creditors in the drought years. I sat through those conversations, and I watched what worked and what didn't. She paused. What worked was being more inconvenient than you were worth. And you think we can be more inconvenient than Hargrove's worth? I think the access road is worth maybe $300 to him in practical terms. I think the legal filing costs him time and money. And if we make the time and money uncomfortable enough, he recalculates. She folded the letter. He's not a man who loses sleep over principle. He's a man who calculates. And if we're wrong? She looked at him honestly. Then we're wrong, and we deal with what comes next. But sitting still and waiting for him to move first isn't working either. He considered this. All right, he said. Send it. She sent it the next Friday from Harlan, through the post, with the county postmark that meant it was on record. March came in gray and difficult, the way Montana March does, not quite winter anymore, but not anything friendlier, just the season grinding through the last of its cruelty before it ran out of cold. The cattle were holding, the finances were holding, barely, the bread income covering the loan payment with $30 or $40 left, which went back into flour and lard and the gradual restocking of a pantry that had been stripped to nothing before she arrived. The town of Cutter's Bend was not what she would call warm toward her. That was fine. She hadn't come here to be liked. But there had been a shift, small, practical, that she'd noticed over the past weeks. The woman at the dry goods store, whose name was Clara Alderman, and whose manner had started out professionally distant, had begun talking to her more while she collected her flour. Not friendly talk exactly, useful talk. Who was in town, what had come through the supply wagon, whether the Harlan Road was passable after the last freeze. The kind of talk that meant, I have decided you are a fixture and I will treat you like one. The standing order at Birch's store had expanded to twice weekly without either of them formally agreeing to it. She'd just started bringing more, and he'd started ordering more, and at some point it was simply a fact. 2 women in Cutter's Bend had asked, separately, if she would teach bread baking, which she'd declined not because she was unwilling, but because she didn't have the time yet and wasn't going to commit to something she couldn't follow through on. Mrs. Pratt was not warming up. Delilah had made her peace with Mrs. Pratt. What she had not made peace with, and was still working on, was the specific judgment in the eyes of certain people when they saw her. The assessment of what she was, what she represented, what her presence in Gideon Cross's home meant about her character. It was not new. She'd been getting versions of that assessment since Thomas died and she started moving. But it didn't get less sharp with repetition. It just became more familiar, which was a different thing. Nora understood this, in her particular 12-year-old way, better than Delilah had expected. You don't let it show when they look at you that way, Nora said one afternoon. They were in the kitchen, Delilah working bread dough, Nora supposedly doing the arithmetic exercises Delilah had been setting her, which Nora was doing while also watching Delilah in the evaluating way she did most things. What way? You know what way. Delilah did know. There's no point in letting it show. Doesn't it make you angry? Yes? Then why? Because showing it gives them something, Delilah said. It lets them know they hit their mark, and I'd rather they not know that. Nora turned this over. Mama used to cry when people were unkind, she said. Not in front of them, after. That's fair too. Did you ever? In the beginning, Delilah said. In the early part, after my husband died, when the first towns turned me away. I'd cry after, and wherever I was sleeping. She kept working the dough. After a while, I didn't have the energy for it anymore, which sounds sad, but mostly it felt like getting tougher. Nora was quiet, thinking. Then, I cried after Mama's funeral, and then I didn't cry again for a long time. Papa thinks I was being brave, but I don't think that's what it was. What do you think it was? I think I was so busy trying to hold everything together that there wasn't room. She looked at her arithmetic. Is that the same thing you're describing? Delilah looked at her for a moment. 12 years old, with a mind like a level, cutting straight to the core of things. Yes, she said. I think that's exactly the same thing. Nora nodded, satisfied with the confirmation, and went back to her arithmetic. The second storm came on a Saturday night in mid-March. It had been threatening all day. That particular stillness in the air before a serious system moves in, the temperature dropping in a way that felt purposeful rather than gradual. Gideon had spent the afternoon securing what needed securing: the loose board on the barn that had been banging since January, the east fence section, the woodpile covered with the oilcloth. He came inside at dusk, smelling of cold and wood resin, and said, "It's going to be bad," with the economy of a man who doesn't speculate beyond what he can observe. By midnight it was bad. The wind was a different animal than the January storm. That one had been relentless and deliberate. This one was volatile, gusting so hard the house shook in irregular intervals, and then going briefly, deceptively quiet before it came back worse. The stovepipe rattled. May woke up at some point in the middle of the night and came downstairs without saying anything, just appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, and stood there until Delilah, who had been unable to sleep and was sitting at the table with the lamp low, saw her and held out one arm. May crossed the room and climbed into her lap. She sat there for a while without talking, listening to the wind, her head against Delilah's shoulder. Then she said, "Is it going to stop?" "By morning," Delilah said. "These ones always do by morning." "How do you know?" "I don't, for certain, but I've been through enough of them to know that's usually how it goes." May considered this. "Were you scared?" "Of the storms?" "Of coming here, when you knocked on the door." Delilah thought about it honestly. "Not of knocking. I was cold enough that scared had worn off by then." She paused. "Maybe a little scared of what you'd all think of me." "We didn't think anything bad," May said, with the complete confidence of a 4-year-old who has revised history slightly in favor of the current narrative. "I thought you smelled like bread." "That's the best thing anyone said about me in years," Delilah said, and meant it. May laughed, the sudden whole-body laugh of small children, and then settled back against her shoulder, and they sat together in the lamplight while the storm worked itself out against the walls of the house. It was Henry who noticed it first in the morning. He came running in from the back hall where the door to the lean-to was, and he was shouting before he was fully through the door, "There's water! The corner of the back room! There's water coming in!" The storm had found a gap in the back wall, somewhere in the chinking between logs, and the combination of wind and wet snow being driven sideways had forced moisture through it. And the back room, Delilah's room, the cold room she'd been sleeping in since January, had several inches of water on the floor near the east corner, and more coming. She and Gideon dealt with it the way they were dealing with most things by this point, together, without extensive discussion, dividing what needed doing by who was better positioned to do it. She moved everything off the floor: her pack, the cot's blankets, the few things she'd acquired over the winter, while Gideon found the gap from the outside, which required going back out into a storm that hadn't fully quit. And she could hear him hammering something, a board over the gap, the sound coming through the wall muffled and determined. Caleb helped her bail water with the bucket. It was too cold for the water to drain fast, just had to be moved manually, and Caleb worked with the focused efficiency of a 9-year-old who has decided this is his problem too, and isn't waiting to be told what to do. "You're going to have to sleep in the main room," he said, "until Papa fixes it properly." "I know. There's room in front of the stove." He hauled the bucket to the back door and flung it out into the yard. "Or you could have Nora's room. Nora and May could share." "I'm not putting your sister out of her room." "She won't mind. She'd say she minds, but she wouldn't." Delilah looked at him. 9 years old, managing logistics with the competence of someone twice his age. "I'll figure out the sleeping situation," she said. "You focus on the bailing." He bailed. She moved her things to the main room and spread the wet blankets near the stove to dry, and tried not to calculate how much of the morning was gone, whether she'd make it to Cutter's Bend, whether the road would even be passable. She decided it probably wasn't, and that today was a day inside, which settled the question. When Gideon came back in, he was soaked through the shoulders, and there was a cut on his forehead that he hadn't noticed from where he'd caught the edge of something in the wind. "You're bleeding again," Nora said from across the room, with the tone of someone who has said this before. "It's nothing." "That's not accurate," Delilah said. She was already at the shelf for the cloth strips. "Sit down." "I have to check the barn. The barn has been there through worse, and it's not going anywhere in the next 5 minutes. Sit down." He sat. There was something different in the way he did it now than in January. Then it had been the surrender of a man too tired to argue. Now it was something closer to trust. He sat because she'd said to, because he'd learned that her instructions in these moments came from observation and not from wanting to manage him. She cleaned the cut. Shallower than it looked, Head wounds always are. And he sat with the particular stillness she associated with him when he was holding himself in place. The gap's patched, he said. It'll need proper rechinking when things dry out. Week, maybe 2. I'll move back when it's done. You can take Caleb's room. He won't. I'm not taking anyone's room. She tied off the bandage. I'll sleep in the main room. I've slept in worse. He looked at her. Shay, you keep saying that. It keeps being true. He was quiet for a moment. The children were at various points around the room. Caleb still bailing, Henry watching from the doorway, May with her blanket on the settle, Nora sitting at the table with her arms folded and the watchful expression she kept in reserve. I got a letter back from Hargrove, Gideon said. She stopped. She hadn't expected that. The letter had been sent 2 weeks ago, and she'd been watching for a response without letting herself expect one on any particular timetable. What does it say? It says, he reached into his coat, which was dripping on the floor, and produced an envelope already opened. It says that the lien filing will be reviewed in light of the payment history and that the commercial activity clause has been withdrawn pending legal review. He looked up from the paper. And it says that the 30-day extension previously requested in November is now retroactively granted. She stared at him. He backed down, partly. Gideon set the letter on the table. The lien is still filed. It's not withdrawn, but it's not being pressed. That's significant. He's recalculating, he said, using her word from before. He's recalculating, she agreed. She sat down at the table. Outside, the storm was finally losing its argument with the morning, the wind dropping to something that merely bit rather than tore. The letter was on the table between them, damp from his coat, the formal language of a man who had decided they weren't worth the trouble. Not a victory exactly. A stay. But a stay meant time, and time was what they needed. She looked up and found all 4 children looking at her. Is it good news? Henry asked. It's better news than we had yesterday, she said. That's the same as good news, he said firmly. She didn't argue with him. It was 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, that she found the note. It had been slid under the front door. She found it when she went to check the weather before bed and saw the folded paper on the floor, which meant someone had come to the door without knocking, which meant someone who didn't want to be seen. She opened it at the table with the lamp. The handwriting was blunt and functional, not educated. The letters pressed hard into the paper. It said, the widow should know when she isn't wanted. Hargrove's business is one thing. What you are to that family is another. People in this county have long memories and short tolerance for women who take what isn't theirs. You've been warned enough times through talk. This is the last word you'll get in writing. No signature. She read it twice. The second time she noted which words were misspelled and which weren't, because some part of her brain defaults to practical observation when the emotional part is doing something loud, and she doesn't want to deal with the loud part yet. Then she folded it and sat with it in her hands for a moment. The lamp making shadows on the wall, the house quiet around her, all 4 children asleep, Gideon asleep. She was angry. She was frightened, not terrified, not the kind of frightened that makes you want to run, but the lower register of it that settles in your stomach and says, this is real, this has edges. Someone had come to the house. Someone who knew where she was, knew her situation, had decided that the letter from Hargrove meant she was still a target worth spending effort on. She considered not showing Gideon. She sat with that option for about 4 minutes and then dismissed it, because she'd told Nora she wouldn't lie, and she'd been treating that the same as telling herself. Keeping this from him would be a species of lie. She considered leaving. She sat with that longer. The note was designed to make her sit with that, she recognized. The language was aimed at the one vulnerability she actually had, the uncertainty about whether she was wanted, whether she belonged, whether the thing she'd been building here was real or just her own need, making her see something that wasn't there. It was well aimed. She gave whoever wrote it credit for knowing where to point. She thought about Henry saying, I think you should stay, May in her lap in the lamplight, Caleb's hands in the bread dough, learning the feel of something real, Nora's face when she'd said, I'll make it close enough that it'll taste like someone who loved your mother tried. She was still sitting there when she heard the stairs creak and looked up and found Nora in the doorway, wrapped in a quilt, her hair loose, squinting against the lamp. Why are you still up? Nora asked. Delilah looked at the folded paper in her hands. She thought about lying, or not lying exactly, just not saying, protecting her. Then she thought about what she'd promised. Come here, she said. I need to tell you something. Nora crossed the room and sat across from her, pulling the quilt tighter. She looked at the note, then at Delilah. Is it bad? It's someone trying to scare me off, Delilah said. They left it under the door. Nora's jaw tightened, the same set her father's had. Can I read it? Delilah handed it to her. Nora read it. Her face went through several things in quick succession. Anger, then the controlled tightening that anger turns into when you decide you're not going to let it show, then something harder underneath. This is about more than Hargrove, she said. Yes. Someone in town. Someone who feels strongly. Are you going to go? Nora asked. She asked it level, the way she asked hard things, looking directly at Delilah across the table, and Delilah understood that the question was not just a question. It was Nora Cross, 12 years old, who had held this household together by sheer force of will while her father worked himself to dust, asking whether the person she'd decided to trust was going to prove that trust correctly placed or not. Delilah looked back at her. No, she said. I'm not going. Even though it might get worse. Even though. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she set the note down on the table between them. We should wake Papa, she said. In the morning, Delilah said. Let him sleep. He has enough. Nora considered this. You're going to sit up with it? For a little while. I'll sit with you, Nora said, and pulled the quilt around herself more firmly in the way of someone settling in, and they sat together at the kitchen table in the late winter dark, while the lamp burned between them and the house held its breath around them, and outside the Montana night went on doing what it always did, cold and indifferent and wide. Gideon read the note in the morning, standing at the kitchen table before the children came down, and his face did the same thing it always did when he was angry. Not loud, not expressive, just a stillness that was too deliberate to be natural. He read it twice, the same way she had, and then he set it down carefully in the way of a man who wants to do something else with his hands and is choosing not to. Did you sleep? He asked. Some. He looked at her. You should have woken me. There was nothing to do in the middle of the night that couldn't wait for morning. That's not the point. I know it's not the point, she said, but you were asleep and you needed to stay that way, so I made a decision and I'll live with it. She poured coffee into his cup and set it near him. The point now is what we do with it. He picked up the note again, held it. The handwriting. Not educated. Someone who works with their hands. Half the county works with their hands. Half the county didn't come to my door in the night. He set it down again. I have an idea who. She waited. There's a man named Doyle who runs cattle on the northeast quarter, 2 miles from here. He's been after that same access road for different reasons than Hargrove. His cattle use the east pasture track in summer, and if it gets consolidated under Hargrove's control, he loses that access too. He's the kind of man who decides the problem is the nearest visible thing rather than the actual source. Gideon wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. He's been hostile since you started making runs to town. He came into Birch's store when you were there in February, I heard. Older man, gray coat, didn't buy anything? That's him? She thought back. She remembered the man, the particular quality of his attention when he'd looked at her. Not curious, more like a man measuring something for removal. He thinks getting rid of me solves something, she said. He thinks you're the simplest piece to move. He's not entirely wrong, she said, and held up a hand before Gideon could respond. I'm not saying I'm going. I'm saying he's read the situation correctly in one respect. I'm the one without roots here. I'm the one who can be pressured. Or the one who can choose not to be pressured. Yes, she said. That too. The stairs creaked. Caleb came down first, as he usually did, and registered the atmosphere in the room with the accuracy of a child who'd been reading adult moods for a long time. What happened? He asked. Nothing you need to worry about, Gideon said, which was the standard answer, and Caleb received it with the standard acceptance that meant he'd store the question and come back to it when conditions were better. Delilah put the note in her coat pocket and started the bread. She went to Cutter's Bend on Wednesday, as she always did. She had thought about not going, not from fear exactly, but from the calculation that visible normalcy was its own statement. Then she decided that visible normalcy was the correct statement and went. Clara Alderman at the dry goods store had heard something. Delilah could tell because Clara's manner was different. Not cold, but careful, with an extra layer of attention under the friendliness. The way people act around someone they've heard troubling things about and haven't yet decided what to believe. Delilah bought her flour and her lard and her salt and didn't say anything about what she'd heard or hadn't heard, and Clara didn't say it either, and they completed the transaction in the normal way. At the post office table, she sold out in an hour and a half. The woman who bought the last 2 loaves, a rancher's wife named Sorensen, who had been a reliable customer since January, looked at her for a moment after handing over her coins and said, with the bluntness of a woman who doesn't have time for circumlocution, "I heard Doyle's been talking about you." "What's he been saying?" "That you're a schemer, that you latched onto Cross while he was down." She folded the loaves into her basket. "I told my husband I don't buy my bread from someone's opinion of another person. I buy it because it's good bread." Delilah looked at her. "I appreciate that." "I'm not saying it to be kind," Sorensen said. "I'm saying it because Doyle ran his mouth about my brother-in-law 6 years back and cost him a contract. And I have a specific and documented opinion of the man." She latched her basket. "You're not the first person he's decided is convenient to blame. You probably won't be the last." She left, and Delilah stood for a moment at the empty table in the cold air outside the post office and let that settle. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent. April moved in slow and complicated. The snow was retreating. Not fully, not cleanly. Montana never gives you a clean seasonal border, but retreating enough that the ground showed in the south-facing patches, and the cattle started finding their own grazing for the first time since November. The creek at the edge of the pasture was running again, snowmelt cold and fast, and Gideon was out from first light dealing with the fence sections that winter had damaged, and the herd that needed sorting after months compressed together. The bread business had changed shape in a way she hadn't entirely planned. Clara Alderman had proposed in mid-March that Delilah use the back room of the dry goods store on Wednesday mornings as a proper selling point, a table, a covered display, out of the weather, rather than standing at the post office table in the cold. It was a practical offer, Clara said, because it brought foot traffic into the store, and that was mutually beneficial. Delilah had accepted, and the Wednesday operation had grown accordingly. She was bringing 8 to 10 loaves now, plus rolls plus, on alternating weeks. The small sugar cakes she'd started making when the sugar supply allowed, which sold before anything else. Birch had asked if she could supply the Harlan store 3 times a week instead of 2. She'd said she'd try. She was working at or past her capacity most days, and she knew it. The ranch work still needed doing. The children still needed minding. The household still needed managing. And she was adding to that rather than trading off against it, which was not a sustainable arithmetic. She knew this and was doing it anyway because the need was real and because something in her had decided quietly and without fanfare that this was the place she was trying to make work. Not just survive. Work. It was Nora who called her on it because Nora called her on most things. "You fell asleep at the table last night," Nora said one morning. "I came down for water and you were asleep with your head on the accounts." "I was resting my eyes." "Your eyes were resting very thoroughly." Nora sat down across from her with the seriousness she brought to conversations she'd decided were necessary. "You're doing too much. The accounts can wait an hour. You can't bake properly when you're exhausted. I know because you told me that. You said the dough knows when you're not paying attention." Delilah stopped. "I did say that." "So." She looked at the 12-year-old across the table and felt the particular slightly absurd quality of being managed by someone you've been managing. "I'll sleep earlier tonight. And I'm going to take the morning roll batch from now on, the house rolls." "Nora, I know how. You taught me. I'm not as good as you, but I'm good enough for the house." She folded her hands on the table, a gesture that was entirely her own, but had something of Gideon's controlled patience in it. "Let me do what I can do." Delilah looked at her for a long moment, then, "The rolls need 40 minutes to rise after you shape them. Not 30. I know I said 30, but 40 is better." 40 minutes, Nora said. "All right. And don't salt the top until they're out of the oven. It pulls moisture while they're baking." "After the oven. Got it." Nora stood up. "Now go to bed. It's still dark." Delilah went to bed. It was the first time in months she'd slept past 4 in the morning, and when she woke up at 5:30 to the smell of bread that was not hers, something in her chest did something complicated and warm that she didn't immediately have a name for. The legal resolution came through in the 3rd week of April, and it came through the way most things that have been building slowly come through, quickly, at the end, as though the whole weight of it had been sitting on a pin that finally gave. The county clerk's office in the town of Morrow, which was the administrative center for the territory district, sent a written response to the formal petition Gideon had filed in March. Delilah had helped draft it, using the same careful statutory language as the letter to Hargrove, citing the irregularity of the commercial activity clause and the documented pattern of a loan modification being refused without stated cause. The response stated that the Lyon filing had been reviewed and found to contain procedural irregularities, specifically regarding the timeline of the default notice relative to the payment records, and that the lien was suspended pending a formal hearing. Suspended was not dismissed, but suspended meant Hargrove couldn't act on it while it was under review, and under review could mean a very long time in a territorial clerk's office with other things to attend to. Gideon read the letter at the kitchen table at dinner, with all 4 children present, because it was that kind of thing. He read it twice, out loud the second time, and Caleb asked what suspended meant, and Henry said he knew what it meant even though he clearly didn't, and May said, "Is it good?" And Nora said, "It means we win for now," which was approximately accurate. Delilah watched Gideon's face while he read it. She watched the thing in his expression that she'd been watching since January, the held breath quality of a man who had been absorbing blows for long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have the wind at his back instead. She watched it shift. "Delilah," he said. He looked up from the letter at her. I don't know if I would have known what to write." "You would have figured it out. Maybe. Slower." He folded the letter. "Thank you." She wanted to say something deflecting, the kind of thing she usually said, just practical, just what needed doing. She didn't. "You're welcome," she said, and it landed straight. It was Doyle who caused the scene in Cutter's Bend, and looking back on it, Delilah thought she should have seen it coming, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because men like Doyle operate on a specific timetable. When the official route closes off, they find the informal one, and the informal route, for a man like Doyle, was public humiliation. She was at Clara's store on a Wednesday morning in late April when he came in. She recognized him immediately. The gray coat, the specific quality of attention he gave her, like she was a fence post he was deciding whether to remove. He was not alone. There was a younger man with him, and 2 women she recognized from previous Wednesdays who were there for their own shopping and who went still when Doyle came through the door in the way that meant they knew him well enough to know when trouble was attached to him. He didn't say anything at first. He walked to the counter and did his business with Clara, and Clara did it without looking at Delilah, which told Delilah that Clara knew what was likely about to happen and was trying to stay out of it. Delilah kept selling bread. A woman named Hicks bought a loaf and the sugar cake she'd been eyeing. An older man bought 2 rolls. She kept her hands busy and her voice level and her back to Doyle. "The widow's still here," he said, loudly enough that it wasn't directed at anyone specific, which is the technique for statements you want the room to hear while pretending you're just talking. She didn't turn around. "Thought you'd have moved on by now," he said. "Most women in your situation know when a place isn't theirs." She turned around. She'd decided in the half-second before she did it that turning around was the right choice. Not turning around was accepting the frame. "Mr. Doyle," she said. He was looking at her with the satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he came for, which was a reaction. "I run a bread business out of this store on Wednesday mornings," she said. "I've been doing it since January. The lien on the Cross property has been suspended by the county clerk's office. I have the documentation if you'd like to see it." She kept her voice even. "I don't know what your objection to me is specifically. If it's the access road situation, that's between you and Hargrove, who was the one restricting the access in the first place, not me." She looked at him directly. "If it's something else, I'm happy to hear it, but I'd rather you say it out loud in plain language than push it through anonymous notes." The room had gone very quiet. Doyle's expression shifted, the satisfaction leaking out of it, replaced by something harder. "I don't know what you're talking about." "All right," she said, "then you don't know what I'm talking about, and I'll leave it there." She turned back to her table. Her hands were steady. She was slightly surprised by this. Behind her there was a pause, and then the sound of Doyle moving toward the door, and his boots on the floor, and the door, and then he was gone. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then the woman named Hicks, who was still standing at the table with her purchases, said, "I'll take another loaf of the dark bread if you have it." "I do," Delilah said, and sold it to her. Well, Clara came to find her after the store cleared out, in the early afternoon when the Wednesday traffic had thinned to nothing and Delilah was packing up her empty trays. "That was well handled," Clara said. I said more than I meant to about the note. You said enough that people know it happened. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Clara leaned against the counter. She was a woman in her mid-40s, solid, with the permanently reddened hands of someone who handled goods in cold air all day, and she had an expression now that was different from her usual professional manner. More direct, more personal. I want to say something to you that I've been thinking for a while. All right, Delilah said. I wasn't sure about you when you started coming in here. A widow alone, moving between towns. It looks a certain way, and I won't pretend I didn't have the same thought that other people had. I know you did, Delilah said. I could tell. Yes, well. Clara looked at her hands. I've changed my position, and I want to tell you that I changed it, not because of anything that happened with Doyle or Hargrove or any of that. I changed it because over the last 3 months I've watched you do something very difficult, very steadily, and you haven't done it for show and you haven't complained about it to anyone who's told me, and that's the kind of thing that revises a first impression. She paused. I also want to say that if you're looking to expand, more days, more product, whatever arrangement makes sense, I'm willing to talk about it. As a business arrangement. Formal. Delilah looked at her for a moment. I'd like that, she said. Clara nodded, the way people nod when something they've been waiting to say has been said and received. Good. She told Gideon about the Doyle confrontation that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to most things she told him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. He won't try again, he said. Not directly. That kind of man needs the other kind of advantage, the official kind, the kind where he can point at something and say, it's not his fault. Take that away and he doesn't have much. You think it's over with him? I think it's done in town. Yes. He looked up. I heard from 2 people today about what happened in Clara's store. By tomorrow, it'll be all the way to Harlan. That's either good or bad. In this case, I think it's good. He turned his coffee cup. Delilah. Something in the way he said her name was different. She registered it before she could identify why. Something in the weight of it. There's something I want to ask you, he said. She waited. I was not a man who struggled with words as a rule. He was precise when he spoke, choosing carefully. But this had the quality of something he'd been circling and hadn't found the right approach to yet. The summer's coming, he said. The ranch is going to need more work, more hands probably. The business you're building is real, and it's going to keep growing. He stopped. I've been thinking about what the arrangement is, going forward, what to call it. Does it need a name? Maybe not. He looked at her. But I'd like to know if you're planning to stay. It was the question under all the questions, she realized. The one that had been accumulating since January, since the first morning she hadn't left, since the coffee she'd had ready when he came in from the cold, since May in her lap and Caleb's hands in the dough, and Nora sitting up with her in the dark, with a note between them. Gideon, she said, I don't have anywhere else I'm trying to go. He absorbed this. That's not quite the same as wanting to stay. No, she said, you're right, it's not. She looked at him steadily. I want to stay. I haven't let myself say it plainly because I wasn't sure if it was my place to say it. But yes, I want to stay. He was quiet for a long moment, the way he was quiet when he'd gotten an answer he'd been waiting for and was sitting with it. The back room is rechunked, he said. I finished it Tuesday. I know, I saw. You can move back in there if you want. He paused. Or you could have the room at the top of the stairs. It gets more morning light. She looked at him. That's your room. I'll take the back room. She understood what he was offering. Not just the room, the whole of it, the gesture underneath the practical language. It was the most this particular man was going to say with words, and she understood that, and she also understood it was enough. I'll stay in the back room for now, she said, which was also a kind of language, the for now carrying what it carried. But thank you. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside the ranch window, the April evening was doing what April evenings do in Montana. The light lasting longer now, the sky going from gray to a thin pale gold before it finally gave in to dark, and the shape of the land visible again after months of snow, the fence lines, and the pasture, and the south ridge, all of it becoming itself again. She had walked in out of that dark in January with nothing but flour and a worn coat, and a kind of stubbornness that she'd mistaken for the absence of hope. She understood now it had been the opposite. The stubbornness was the hope. It was just hope that had learned to work instead of wait. May appeared at the top of the stairs and leaned over the railing. Is there more bread? She asked, with the directness of a 4-year-old who has decided this is a reasonable time to want bread. There's rolls from this morning, Delilah said. Come down and I'll warm one. May came down the stairs one careful step at a time, holding the rail, and crossed the room and leaned against Delilah's leg in the automatic way she had, and Delilah put a hand on her hair without thinking about it. And across the table, Gideon watched this with an expression she didn't look at directly, because some things are private even when they happen in front of you, and she was learning which things to see and which to let be. She got up and warmed the roll. The evening settled around them, ordinary and necessary and real, and the ranch outside held its ground against the spring, the way it held its ground against everything. Not easily, not without cost, but stubbornly, and with the particular determination of something that intends to last. Spring in Montana doesn't ask permission. It just arrives one morning in the smell of the ground, in the particular quality of the light coming through the kitchen window at 6 a.m., in the way the mud in the yard pulls at your boots differently than frozen earth does. Softer, more complicated, with something working underneath it. Delilah noticed it on a Tuesday in early May when she went out to the woodpile and the air hit her face without the edge that had been in it since October. And she stood there for a moment with her arms full of wood and just breathed. She had been at the Cross Ranch for 4 months. She did not track it consciously. She wasn't the kind of person who marked time by anniversaries. But the awareness of it was there, in the background, the way your own heartbeat is always there. 4 months since the fence corner in the blizzard. 4 months since Nora's hand on the bolt. 4 months since she'd told herself she would stay 3 days and leave when the storm cleared. The storm had cleared in January. She was still here. Inside, Caleb was already up and in the kitchen, which had been his habit for 6 weeks now. He came down early on baking days to do the morning roll batch, a task he had taken on with the seriousness of someone who understood he was doing real work, not practice. He was 10 years old and his rolls were good. Not as consistent as hers, not yet, but genuinely good, with the specific quality that comes from hands that have started to know the dough rather than just handle it. Temperature's warm today, he told her when she came in. I know, I felt it. Does that change the rise time? She set the wood down and thought about it. A little, maybe 5 minutes less. Watch the dough, not the clock. He nodded and went back to his shaping, and she started the larger batches for the Wednesday run, and the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of their established morning. And Delilah thought, not for the first time, but with more clarity than usual, that this was the specific thing she had not known she was looking for. Not safety, exactly. Not comfort. Something more like function. A place where she had use, where the work she did connected to the people she did it for, where the days accumulated into something rather than just passing. She had spent 3 years passing. The formal hearing on the Hargrove lien was scheduled for the second week of May in Morrow. Gideon had been there twice before on ranch business, the kind of trip that takes the better part of 2 days with the wagon, and he'd said very little about the hearing in the weeks leading up to it, which was not the same as not thinking about it. She knew him well enough by now to read the difference. He was sleeping less. He was out earlier and in later, working harder than the season required, which was what he did when his mind was occupied and needed somewhere to put itself. She brought it up the night before he was due to leave. The children were in bed. He was at the table with the loan documents spread out in front of him, the same documents he'd looked at so many times the fold lines were going soft. You know those by memory, she said. I know them, he agreed. I just keep thinking I've missed something. You haven't. She sat down across from him. The payment records are complete. The procedural filing is correct. The irregularity in the lien notice is documented. The case is, it's solid, Gideon. Solid doesn't always mean it goes the way it should. No, she said honestly. It doesn't. She folded her hands on the table. But Hargrove is a man who calculates, and the calculation right now is that pressing this lien costs him more than letting it die. The clerk's review already told him that. He filed the lien to pressure us into giving up the access road without a fight. We didn't give it up, and we made the fight inconvenient. She paused. I think he's going to withdraw it before the hearing. Gideon looked at her. What makes you think that? Because I would, in his position. The hearing creates a record. A record means other creditors in the territory can see how he operates. That's bad for a man whose business depends on other people being too scared or too isolated to push back. She tapped the stack of documents. We pushed back. That changes his math. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers. You might be right. I might be wrong, but I don't think I am. He gathered the papers into a stack and aligned them carefully, the way he handled things he wanted to keep in order. I want you to come to the hearing. She hadn't expected that. Gideon, you drafted half these documents. You understand the legal language better than I do, and he stopped for a moment. And I'd rather not walk into that room alone. She looked at him across the table. He was not a man who said I'd rather not be alone easily. She suspected he had not said it in some years. Who watches the children? She asked. I talked to Sorensen's wife. She said she'd come over for 2 days. She looked at him. You already arranged it. I was going to ask you. I just arranged it first. In case I said no. In case you needed a practical reason to say yes. She almost smiled. That's very calculated of you. I learn from who I spend time with, he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, dry, quiet, with the particular weight of words that mean more than they say. All right, she said. I'll come. They left before dawn on a Wednesday, which meant Clara's store would open without its Wednesday bread, a thing Delilah had arranged by leaving a double batch the day before with a note of explanation. The road tomorrow was long, and the morning was cold in the way May mornings still could be, and they drove in the comfortable partial silence she'd gotten used to with him. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but of people who don't need to fill space. She watched the land pass. The snow was gone from everything but the highest ridges now, and the grass was coming in the pale tentative green of early spring, and the mountains to the west were the particular blue-white of distant snow against a clearing sky. She had crossed this landscape in January, in a blizzard with nothing but a pack and a dead certainty that she was running out of options. She looked at it now from the bench of Gideon Cross's wagon and felt the strangeness of that gap. Not disbelief exactly, more like the vertigo of holding two versions of yourself in the same moment. What are you thinking? He asked. That I was here in January and I didn't see any of this. It wasn't there in January. No, she said, but also I wasn't looking. He glanced at her, then back at the road. He didn't ask her to explain it, and she didn't, because it was the kind of thought that was complete in itself. Hargrove withdrew the lien at 9 in the morning before the hearing was called. His lawyer delivered the paperwork to the clerk's office with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a transaction they'd been instructed to make quick and clean. There was no explanation offered, no statement of goodwill, no acknowledgement that the original filing had been irregular. It was simply withdrawn, the way you take a piece off a board when you've decided the play isn't worth the position. Delilah and Gideon stood in the corridor of the clerk's office and read the withdrawal notice, and the clerk, a small man named Pruitt, who had the air of someone who had seen a great many things come and go through that corridor without being much surprised by any of them, stamped it and handed Gideon his copy. That's it, Gideon said, not to Pruitt specifically, just to the air. That's it, Pruitt said anyway. Property's clear. You can file a release of lien record by the end of the month if you want the title clean. We'll file it today, Delilah said. Pruitt looked at her with mild interest. You're the baking woman. I am. Heard about you. He turned to get the release form. Heard about the Doyle business in Cutter's Bend. My wife's cousin is Clara Alderman. Small territory, she said. Smaller than people like, he said, and handed Gideon the form. They filed the release and were back on the road by noon, and Gideon didn't say much until they were well clear of Morrow, and the road had widened out into the open country, and then he said, with the particular quietness of someone putting down something heavy, It's done. It's done, she agreed. He was quiet another moment. I keep waiting for the next thing. There'll be a next thing, she said. There always is. But it won't be this thing. He looked at the road ahead. When Ruth died, I thought I just had to get through it. Get through the grief. Get through the financial situation. Get through the winter. And then after I got through all of it, there'd be something on the other side. He paused. I never thought about what the other side actually looked like. She understood exactly what he meant. The getting through becomes its own kind of life, she said. And then you have to learn how to live differently, and you've forgotten how that works. Yes. They drove for a while. I haven't forgotten, he said quietly. I thought I had. I don't think I have. She didn't answer immediately. She let the road pass under the wagon wheels and watched a hawk working the thermals over the south ridge, and thought about what she wanted to say versus what was true, and concluded that they were the same thing, which didn't always happen. Neither have I, she said. May became June, and June was a different world. The cattle were on summer pasture. The creek was full and running hard with snowmelt. Gideon had hired a hand for the summer, a young man named Wick, 17, the son of a rancher 2 valleys over who was too old for his father's place and not yet ready to find his own, and the addition of one more set of hands changed the ranch's operating rhythm considerably. Work that had been deferred for want of capacity started getting done. The barn roof patched properly. The north fence rebuilt rather than just mended. The broken wagon wheel finally reunited with its wagon. The bread business had become, genuinely, a business. Clara had given her the back room of the dry goods store on Wednesdays and Fridays. Not just a table, but proper counter space. And the 2-day arrangement had generated a steady customer base that now included orders placed in advance. Women who wanted specific quantities for households. The hotel in Cutter's Bend that had asked for a standing weekly order of 12 loaves. Birch's store in Harlan that had expanded to full week supply. She'd done the arithmetic with Gideon in June, and the numbers had come out on the other side of something that felt like permanence. The bread income was no longer bridge financing against the loan. It was its own thing. A second income for a working built out of flour and pre-dawn mornings, and a woman who had learned to turn whatever she had into what she needed. Caleb was selling his rolls. That had started in May, almost accidentally. He'd brought a batch to Cutter's Bend on a Wednesday while she was setting up, and Clara had asked to put them out separately with a small card that said Caleb's Rolls because she thought customers would find it charming, which was a calculation about human nature that turned out to be correct. He sold 10 rolls his first Wednesday, which was the entire batch, and he came home with the coins counted out in his palm with an expression of complete and slightly stunned satisfaction. "That's mine," he said at dinner. "I made that." "You did," Delilah said. "Can I keep it?" "It's yours," Gideon said. "Put half of it away." "What's the other half for?" "More flour," Delilah said, and Caleb laughed, and then stopped laughing and nodded seriously, because he'd understood immediately, because he was 10 years old and had learned from watching someone do real work what real work meant. It was Nora, in July, who said the thing out loud that had been building in the household the way summer thunderheads build, visibly, over time, with everyone watching and nobody saying. They were in the kitchen, the two of them, in the late afternoon with the light coming in long and gold, and the sounds of Gideon and Wick outside somewhere working on the barn, Henry and May in the yard, Caleb at the creek doing whatever it is 10-year-old boys do at creeks when no one is supervising closely. Nora was kneading bread. She'd gotten good, consistently good, which was not the same as being Delilah, but was its own real skill. And she said without preamble, the way she said most hard things, "Do you love my father?" Delilah's hand stilled in her own dough for a half second. Then she kept working. "That's a direct question," she said. "I know, I'm asking it directly." She thought about how to answer this honestly without either overstating or deflecting, which was a narrow path between two easy mistakes. "I care about him very much," she said. "I respect him. I think he's a good man who has been through a great deal and handled most of it with more grace than I could have." She paused. "Whether that's love depends on what you mean by the word. I mean, do you want to stay because of him? Not just the children and the ranch and the business, because of him." She looked at Nora. 13 now. Her birthday in February had come and gone with the molasses spice cake Delilah had made from the recipe she'd reconstructed from Nora's description. More cinnamon than most people would, the icing too sweet, and Nora had eaten 2 pieces without comment except to say quietly that it was close. That close had meant a great deal to both of them. "Yes," she said, "because of him too." Nora kneaded in sentences for a moment. "He's been different since you came," she said. "He was disappearing before. Not in a way you could point at, just smaller. Every week a little smaller." She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough with the focused efficiency she'd developed. "He's not disappearing anymore." Delilah didn't trust herself to answer that, so she kept working. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it," Nora said. "I just wanted to know if you knew." "I know," Delilah said. "Okay," said Nora, and went back to her bread. Gideon asked her on an August evening when the summer was starting its slow lean toward autumn, the light already coming in at a different angle, the nights cooler. He asked her the way he did most things, with more preparation than it appeared and less ceremony than the occasion probably warranted. They were on the porch after dinner, the children inside, Wick gone home for the night. The sky was doing what August skies do in Montana, going through colors that seemed too extravagant to be real, orange and rose and a deep blue at the top that looked painted. They were sitting in the two chairs Gideon had repaired in June, the ones that had been falling apart on the porch since before Ruth died, which he had finally gotten to. He said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. I was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon, and she let him take his time because she'd learned that was what he needed. "I've been thinking about what you are here," he said, "what we are. And I keep coming back to the fact that I don't have language for it that fits. You're not a hired hand. You're not—" He stopped. "You're not a guest. You haven't been a guest since January." "No," she said. "I don't think I have. The children—" He stopped again, in the different way. "May calls you Mama Delilah. I don't know if you've noticed." "I've noticed. Does it bother you?" She looked at the sky. "No," she said. "It doesn't bother me." He turned to look at her. In the fading light, his face was the face she knew well now. The weather-lined edges, the eyes that held things carefully, the jaw that went tight when he was feeling something he hadn't named yet. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not the way you're staying now, which is not temporary anymore, but not permanent either. I want you to stay in the way that means this is yours, the ranch, the kitchen, the children." He paused. "Me, if that's something you want." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the fence corner in January, the blizzard, the sound of a child crying. She thought about standing at that corner and having the choice. Keep moving, which was the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing that cost the least. She had made the other choice, and it had cost her, and it had given her more than she had known how to want. She had arrived with a sack of bread and a broken life, and she had been building, one loaf at a time, one cold morning at a time, one honest conversation at a time, something she had not expected to build again. She had not expected this house, these children, this man. She had not expected any of it, and she had learned by now that the things you don't expect are frequently the things that turn out to be load-bearing. "Yes," she said, "that's something I want." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the porch while the sky finished its business, and the stars came out one at a time over the Montana dark, and the ranch sat quiet around them, breathing. They married in September, at the ranch, which was the practical choice and also the right one. It was not a large ceremony. There was no particular community infrastructure for officiating a wedding that didn't involve either a church or a circuit preacher, and Delilah had no appetite for either, and Gideon had less. What they had was a county clerk who rode out from Morrow on a Saturday, which Pruitt had arranged after Gideon rode in and asked him about options, and Pruitt's wife, who came with him because she had heard about Delilah from Clara Alderman and wanted to put a face to the story, and Clara herself, who drove out with her husband, and Sorensen and her husband from down the valley, and Birch from Harlan, who came alone and quietly and stood at the back of the yard with his hat in his hands, looking moved by something. Nora stood beside Delilah. This had not been discussed or planned. On the morning of the wedding, Nora had simply come and stood next to her at the appropriate moment with the particular quiet determination of someone who has decided where she belongs and isn't waiting for permission. Caleb had made rolls for the gathering. He'd been up since 4 to do it, which Delilah knew because she'd been up since 4 herself, and they'd worked in the kitchen together in the dark and lamplight, not talking much, just working, the comfortable parallel labor of two people who have learned each other's rhythms in a shared space. May wore her best dress and fell down in the yard twice before the ceremony started and cried briefly, and then stopped crying and resumed running because she was 4 and then almost 5, and the world was too interesting to stay still in. Henry shook the clerk's hand very seriously and told him that Delilah made the best bread in the territory, which made the clerk laugh, and which Henry received with dignity. It was not a perfect day. The weather was fine, but the cake Delilah had made, which she'd been practicing in her head for a week, collapsed slightly on one side when she brought it out. And Nora had said, "It's fine, you can't even tell," which was not accurate. And Delilah had said, "You can clearly tell," and Nora had said, "Well, it tastes right, and that's what matters." And that was the end of that. Gideon said his words in the way he said everything, plainly, looking directly at her, with the particular quality of a man who has decided something completely and is not performing the decision but simply stating it, She said hers the same way. It felt right to do it that way. It felt like them. By October, the ranch was carrying itself. That was the only way she knew to say it. Not comfortable, not easy. The work was still what it always was. The winter was coming again. There would be fences down and cattle lost and difficult months ahead. But the underlying structure was sound now in a way it hadn't been the year before. The loan was being serviced. The lien was released. The bread business covered its costs and contributed, and would be larger in the spring when Clara had proposed they discuss a more formal shop arrangement. The children they were themselves, which was complicated and ongoing and the best possible outcome. Nora was 13 and reading everything she could get her hands on, and had developed strong opinions about most of it, and was increasingly difficult to argue with, which Delilah considered a success and Gideon considered inevitable. Caleb had started keeping his own account ledger. He was 10, and his arithmetic was imprecise, but his instinct for what things cost relative to what they brought in was remarkably accurate, and Delilah had started asking him to check her figures, which he did with visible pride and occasional corrections that were right about half the time. Henry had decided he wanted to be a veterinarian. He announced this at dinner in September, and Gideon had said that was a long way away, but they could find him books. And Delilah had said there were veterinary texts in the catalog from the Morrow Library, and Henry had said good, and then asked for more bread. May could write her own name and 14 other words, and counted to 30 with only one consistent error, which was that she always skipped 16. Nobody knew why. She herself was not able to explain it. She just went from 15 to 17 with complete confidence and then continued. On the last warm afternoon of October, Delilah went out to the south pasture. No particular reason. She'd been inside most of the day and the light was doing something specific in the late afternoon. The angle of autumn light, long and slightly melancholy, the kind that makes you want to be outside for reasons you can't entirely articulate. She walked to the south pasture and stood at the fence and looked at the cattle and the ridge and the sky. She thought about the woman who had come across this land in January with a sack of bread and no address and no clear idea of what came next. Only the conviction that stopping was not possible, and the cold-worn obstinacy that had kept her upright when most of what was sensible had run out. She thought about the things that woman had been told, that she was the wrong kind of presence, that she was brazen, that she should know when a place wasn't hers. She had learned something over the course of this year that she wished she'd known earlier. Not because knowing it earlier would have saved her the hard parts. You don't get the knowledge without the hard parts. That's not how it works. But because it might have made the hard parts feel less like proof that she was wrong. What she'd learned was this: belonging is not a thing that gets issued. It's not something a town decides to give you or a community confers. It's not in the welcome or the tolerance or the eventual acceptance of people who watched you for a long time before they decided you were worth accepting. All of that is real and it matters, but it's not the source. The source is the choice you make when you're standing at a fence corner in a blizzard with every sensible option pointing one direction and something, not certainty, not hope exactly, just the raw unwillingness to keep walking past a child who is crying, pointing the other. The belonging starts there, in the choosing. You build it the same way you build everything worth having, one day at a time, imperfectly, with what you have, for the people in front of you. She had built it. Not alone. She could not have built any of it alone, and she wasn't going to tell herself a story that made her the sole architect of something that 4 children and one hard, good man had built alongside her. But she had been the one who turned toward the sound. She had been the one who knocked. That mattered. She was allowing herself, finally, to know that it mattered. The sun was getting low. Behind her, across the pasture and the yard, the kitchen light came on in the window, the specific warm yellow of lamplight, which she recognized from a long way off because she had been the one who lit it most evenings, and before her there had been no one, and the window had been dark. It was lit now. She turned and walked back across the pasture toward it, through the long grass and the cooling air, and she did not rush. She had somewhere to be, and she knew where it was, and that was enough. Inside, Caleb was burning something he was pretending not to be burning, and May was asking Nora a question that Nora was answering with slightly compressed patience, and Henry was sitting at the table drawing an animal that may have been a horse, or may have been something he'd invented, and Gideon was at the window. And when she came through the door, he looked up at her the way he'd been looking up at her for months now, with the settled attention of a man who knows someone is going to come through the door and is glad when they do. "The rolls," Caleb said, without turning from the stove, "are not burnt. They're They're dark, Delilah said, hanging her coat. Take them out. He took them out. They were dark, not burnt. She stood in the middle of the kitchen she had been using for 10 months and looked at the 4 children and the man and the lamplight and the smell of imperfectly browned rolls, and she thought, simply, without ceremony, this is mine. Not in the possessive way, in the other way. The way that means, I belong to this and it belongs to me. And that is not something anyone can file a lien against. She went and helped Caleb salvage the rolls, and the evening did what evenings do when a family is whole. It accumulated, hour by ordinary hour, into the quiet and irreplaceable substance of a life.